In an era when cowboys still ruled cinema, some westerns broke every rule. They weren't about heroes in white hats. They were about blood, greed, and moral collapse. But here's the twist. Many were banned, censored, or buried by studios terrified of public outrage. These weren't your father's westerns. They were the films that made Hollywood whisper, "This went too far." El Topo. 1970. When El Topo hit theaters, audiences didn't know what to think. Was it a western? A hallucination? A sermon from the desert? Directed by Alejandro Jodorowsky, it followed a black-clad gunfighter wandering a surreal landscape of monks, murderers, and mystics. But its blend of violence and spirituality made critics recoil, and censors panic. In Mexico, the film was briefly banned for blasphemy after church groups protested scenes depicting religious symbols drenched in blood. Even in America, where John Lennon reportedly loved it, distributors were hesitant to touch it. It ran only in underground midnight screenings, the kind of places where counterculture thrived. Behind the scenes, Jodorowsky's uncompromising vision alienated his cast and terrified producers. He shot scenes with real corpses, live animals, and long takes of simulated death rituals. The result was hypnotic, grotesque, and unforgettable. For years, El Topo circulated through bootlegs, whispered about by filmmakers like David Lynch and Nicholas Winding Refn. It was less a western than a cosmic riddle, a psychedelic reckoning with violence and divinity. And when the dust settled, it had become the world's first midnight movie, banned, embraced, and reborn as legend. Even today, El Topo reminds us that the Wild West was never about the land. It was about the soul, and what happens when it gets lost in the desert. The Hunting Party. 1971. Hollywood thought it was releasing a gritty revenge film. What it got was a firestorm. The Hunting Party, starring Oliver Reed, Candice Bergen, and Gene Hackman, turned the Western into a blood-soaked nightmare. Hackman played a wealthy rancher obsessed with vengeance after a gang of outlaws kidnaps his wife. But the film's depiction of brutality crossed a line few were ready for. Reviewers walked out. Censors in the UK banned it for extreme cruelty, citing graphic horse killings and the film's nihilistic tone. Unlike traditional westerns where good triumphs, The Hunting Party left audiences shaken. No redemption, no morality, just carnage and revenge. It was marketed as an adult western, but critics accused it of glorifying violence. Behind the camera, the production was as chaotic as the film itself. Reed and Hackman clashed constantly, both known for their volatile tempers and heavy drinking. The set became infamous for real injuries and unpredictable outbursts. Director Don Medford pushed for realism, often shooting live ammunition scenes dangerously close to actors. For decades, the film disappeared from circulation, surviving only through late-night European broadcasts. When rediscovered, it gained cult status for its raw depiction of human depravity beneath the cowboy myth. Today, The Hunting Party stands as one of the few westerns that dared to strip away heroism completely. Its message was brutal. Civilization wasn't the antidote to violence, it was its disguise. Cutthroats 9, 1972. At first glance, Cutthroats 9 looked like another gritty Spanish spaghetti western. But what audiences got was something much darker, a film so violent it was banned in several countries and given an X rating across Europe. Directed by Joaquin Luis Romero Marchant, it followed a group of chained convicts trudging through snow toward their execution until greed and madness turned them against each other. What set it apart wasn't just the gore, it was the philosophy behind it. Every drop of blood revealed something rotten inside the human soul. In Spain, censors were horrified. Under Franco's regime, depictions of moral corruption and anti-authority sentiment were forbidden. Cutthroats 9 was banned domestically and distributed only abroad, where its extreme violence made it infamous among grindhouse fans. Critics called it a Western filmed by a sadist, while others saw it as a savage metaphor for fascism and power. Behind the scenes, the crew endured freezing mountain conditions, and the budget was so low that fake blood was mixed with real animal parts to save money. The brutality wasn't an illusion, it was exhaustion, desperation, and anger captured on film. The movie vanished for years before resurfacing on VHS, rediscovered by horror collectors. Today, it's considered the most violent Western ever made, a film that bled beyond its own screen. Cutthroats 9 didn't just go too far, it reminded the world that sometimes the wilderness lives inside us. A Town Called Bastard, 1971. When A Town Called Bastard premiered, even its title made censors flinch. In Britain, it was renamed A Town Called Hell, but the damage was done. This wasn't a story about heroes riding into the sunset. It was a grim, cynical portrait of greed and betrayal that scandalized both critics and audiences. The film starred Robert Shaw and Telly Savalas as rival mercenaries in a post-revolutionary Mexican town ruled by vengeance. The dusty streets ran red with blood, and the so-called good guys were as corrupt as the villains. Director Robert Parrish drenched the story in moral decay, making it a far cry from the romantic westerns of John Wayne's America. Spanish authorities banned the movie for its political subtext, a savage commentary on revolution and power that hit too close to home during Franco's dictatorship. Even in the United States, television networks refused to advertise it, calling it unfit for family audiences. Behind the scenes, the film was chaos. The production company ran out of money halfway through filming, forcing the director to combine unfinished storylines. Robert Shaw reportedly rewrote his own dialogue on set, while Savalas refused to shoot some of the most violent scenes unless given extra pay. Audiences were repulsed, but intrigued. Critics dismissed it as nihilistic filth. Yet over the years, A Town Called Bastard earned cult admiration for its unapologetic darkness and unflinching moral ambiguity. It didn't just question the Western myth, it shattered it. And in doing so, it revealed the ugly truth. Every frontier has its devils, and not all of them carry guns. Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia, 1974. When Sam Peckinpah directed Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia, he wasn't trying to please anyone. He was exorcising demons. But what he delivered was so shocking, so unapologetically violent, that even his studio tried to bury it. The film followed a washed-up piano player, played by Warren Oates, who embarks on a brutal journey through Mexico to claim a bounty, the decapitated head of a man named Alfredo Garcia. What began as a quest for money spiraled into a descent into madness, blood, and nihilism. When it premiered, audiences recoiled. Critics called it the most repulsive film ever made, while some countries, including several in Latin America, banned it for its grotesque violence and moral decay. The Catholic Church publicly condemned it, citing its portrayal of death and desecration as spiritual corruption. Behind the scenes, Peckinpah was battling alcoholism and paranoia. The production was plagued by fights, erratic behavior, and on-set improvisation that blurred the line between performance and breakdown. Warren Oates, wearing Peckinpah's own sunglasses throughout the movie, reportedly mirrored the director's unraveling psyche. At the time, it bombed. But decades later, critics reappraised it as one of the most haunting anti-westerns ever made. A masterpiece drenched in rage, regret, and sand. Tarantino, Rodriguez, and countless others cite it as a major influence. Its message cut deeper than any bullet. When men chase death for profit, they lose their souls long before they die. The Hired Hand, 1971. Peter Fonda's The Hired Hand began as a passion project, a quiet, introspective Western meant to explore redemption and loss. But when Universal Pictures saw the finished cut, they panicked. The film was banned in several conservative territories for moral ambiguity, and pulled from theaters after just a week. The story followed a weary drifter, Harry, played by Fonda, who returns home to the wife and daughter he abandoned years before. What unfolds is not the gun-blazing Western audiences expected, but a dreamlike, melancholy meditation on regret, forgiveness, and death. Critics were divided. Some praised its beauty, its haunting cinematography by Vilmos Zsigmond turned every sunset into poetry. Others called it hippie revisionism, accusing Fonda of desecrating the traditional Western hero. In parts of the South and Midwest, theater owners refused to show it, claiming it mocked masculinity and celebrated weakness. Behind the camera, Fonda clashed with executives who demanded more action and less introspection. He refused. The frontier wasn't about violence, he said. It was about survival, and the cost of it. The film flopped, then vanished, until its 2001 restoration revealed its quiet brilliance. Today, The Hired Hand is revered as one of the first true revisionist westerns, a film that mourned the death of the Old West rather than mythologized it. Its banning was proof of its power. It didn't go too far. It just went too deep. Heaven's Gate, 1980. Though technically released in 1980, Heaven's Gate was conceived, filmed, and censored throughout the late 70s, the final gasp of the era's forbidden westerns. Michael Cimino's epic saga of greed, violence, and class warfare terrified studios and critics alike. Based loosely on the Johnson County War, it followed immigrant settlers clashing with wealthy cattle barons in Wyoming. It was stunning, massive, and merciless. But the controversy came not from its beauty, but from its brutality. Reports surfaced of real animal killings on set, sparking international outrage. Britain, Germany, and several animal rights organizations demanded bans. Cimino's perfectionism drove the budget into oblivion, ballooning from $11 million to over $40 million. United Artists collapsed under the financial strain, and the film became Hollywood's ultimate cautionary tale. Some theaters refused to screen it, citing excessive cruelty and indecency. Behind the scenes, Cimino ruled the set like a tyrant, shooting hundreds of takes, rebuilding entire towns, and ordering actual explosions in fragile landscapes. Cast and crew mutinied, production nearly shut down multiple times. The result was a masterpiece misunderstood. Initially reviled as a disaster, Heaven's Gate has since been reappraised as one of the greatest westerns ever made, a sweeping indictment of capitalism and the corruption of the American ideal. It went too far only because it told the truth. In the American West, paradise was always built on someone else's grave. The Spikes Gang, 1974. When The Spikes Gang hit theaters, it looked like a coming-of-age Western, but underneath the surface lay something far darker. Directed by Richard Fleischer and starring Lee Marvin, Gary Grimes, and Ron Howard, it told the story of three naive farm boys who idolize an aging outlaw, only to find that the myth of freedom comes with a cost written in blood. At first glance, the film seemed like an adventure, but its unflinching portrayal of innocence, corrupted by violence, left audiences stunned. The story spiraled from youthful curiosity to brutal disillusionment, showing the boys becoming cold-blooded killers under Marvin's manipulative mentorship. It wasn't heroic. It was horrifying. In the United States, several community boards and religious groups protested its release, claiming it was moral poison disguised as youth entertainment. In Canada and the UK, the film faced temporary bans for graphic executions and destructive influence. Critics attacked it for dismantling the Western ideal, where bravery and honor were replaced by desperation and despair. Behind the scenes, Fleischer insisted on realism. The gunfights were shot in single takes, with dirt, smoke, and trembling fear instead of choreographed glamour. Lee Marvin, battling alcoholism, gave one of his rawest performances. a man who'd seen too much of life's darkness to pretend anymore. Over time, the Spikes gang became a cult favorite, praised for its bleak honesty and psychological depth. It was less about the West and more about America's lost innocence. In a decade obsessed with heroes, this film whispered the truth. Some legends are better left untold. Johnny Firecloud, 1975. Few Westerns burned as fiercely or as controversially as Johnny Firecloud. Produced by American International Pictures, it blended the Western genre with exploitation cinema, telling the story of a Native American Vietnam veteran who returns home to face racism, violence, and corruption in a small desert town. On the surface, it was a revenge story, but beneath that, it was a political grenade. Its depiction of Native American injustice, lynchings, and systemic hate was too raw for the mid-1970s. Several states banned the film outright for inciting racial division. Others labeled it un-American. Director William Allen Castleman claimed the goal was to expose hypocrisy, how the same country that mythologized cowboys had erased its indigenous people. But the brutality shocked viewers. There were no clean shootouts or moral lessons, just rage and retribution. The film was pulled from theaters after only a few days in many regions. Behind the scenes, lead actor Victor Mojica, himself of Native American heritage, clashed with studio executives who wanted to cut the film's political content. He refused, stating, "This isn't revenge, it's remembrance." The tension made the movie even more powerful and even more unwanted. Johnny Firecloud became a whisper in Hollywood history, surviving through rare VHS prints and underground screenings. Today, it's seen as a forgotten gem of protest cinema, one that used the Western's familiar imagery to tell the story the genre had always avoided. It was banned not because it lied, but because it dared to tell the truth. Ulzana's Raid, 1972. Ulzana's Raid might be one of the most misunderstood Westerns ever made. Directed by Robert Aldrich and starring Burt Lancaster, it was released during the height of the Vietnam War, and that's exactly why it terrified censors. The story followed an Apache warrior, Ulzana, leading a brutal series of raids across the frontier while a young cavalry officer tries to stop him. But beneath the guns and dust, Aldrich was making a metaphor for modern warfare, exposing the futility, the savagery, and the moral collapse on both sides. Audiences weren't ready. In Europe, censors banned or cut entire reels for excessive cruelty. In Germany, it was condemned as too realistic to be entertainment. The film's portrayal of violence, stripped of heroism, devoid of justice, made it one of the most politically charged Westerns of its time. Behind the scenes, Aldrich clashed with the studio over tone. He refused to make Ulzana a villain or the cavalry heroes. Lancaster's weathered scout character offered a grim wisdom that violence was part of human nature, not confined to any side. The dialogue echoed war correspondence more than cowboys. Critics were divided. Some called it the most intelligent Western ever made. Others called it sick. For soldiers returning from Vietnam, it felt like a mirror they didn't want to face. Banned, censored, and reviled, Ulzana's Raid endures as a masterpiece of moral ambiguity. It was less a Western than a warning. When civilization calls itself righteous, the frontier starts all over again. The Wild Bunch, 1969. Though released just before the 70s, Sam Peckinpah's The Wild Bunch defined the decade's rebellion, and its bans stretched well into it. When the film opened, audiences gasped, critics revolted, and governments censored it. Peckinpah's vision of the dying West, all grit, dust, and blood, was too real for its time. The story followed a group of aging outlaws facing extinction as the modern world encroaches on their violent way of life. It wasn't about good versus evil. It was about survival and decay. The film's opening massacre, filled with slow-motion bloodshed, shattered Hollywood taboos. The British Board of Film Censors initially refused classification. Spain banned it entirely. Australia cut nearly 10 minutes of footage. Even American theaters pulled it after protests from church groups and the press, who labeled it a symphony of sadism. Behind the scenes, Peckinpah fought studio executives over every frame. Warner Bros. Wanted a standard Western. Peckinpah delivered a savage elegy. He demanded realism, real explosions, real squibs, real danger. Actors were injured, sets destroyed, tempers exploded. The chaos translated to the screen, raw, frantic, unforgettable. What many missed was its deeper tragedy. These men weren't monsters. They were relics, clinging to a world that had no place for them anymore. Over time, The Wild Bunch became legend, a film that forced audiences to confront the truth behind the Western fantasy. It wasn't violence that disturbed them. It was what the violence meant. The Wild Bunch wasn't just banned. It was buried, reborn, and redefined as one of the greatest and most dangerous films ever made. Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, 1973. Sam Peckinpah returned to the Western with Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, but this time the rebellion was personal. The film was an elegy for outlaws and directors alike, and its battle with censors and studios became Hollywood legend. The story chronicled the doomed friendship between lawman Pat Garrett, James Coburn, and outlaw Billy the Kid, Chris Christopherson. But instead of a thrilling chase, Peckinpah delivered a mournful, poetic meditation on betrayal and death, punctuated by Bob Dylan's haunting ballads. When MGM executives saw the rough cut, they panicked. They hacked 20 minutes from the film, removing key scenes that gave it heart and meaning. Critics savaged the released version as confusing and nihilistic. In several countries, it was banned for excessive violence, though the cuts had already softened it. Behind the scenes, Peckinpah was at war with everyone, drunk, defiant, and convinced the studio wanted to destroy him. He reportedly pulled a gun on an executive who tried to shorten the film. Cast members described the production as a siege. The uncut version wouldn't surface for decades. When it did, audiences saw the masterpiece that had been buried, a slow, mournful requiem for freedom and friendship. Dylan's "Knocking on Heaven's Door," written for the film, became an anthem for everything the movie stood for. It wasn't just a Western, it was Peckinpah's confession, a film too honest, too wounded, and too human for Hollywood to accept in its time. The Missouri Breaks, 1976. If there was ever a Western that broke the genre and the patience of audiences, it was The Missouri Breaks. Starring Marlon Brando and Jack Nicholson, it promised star power and prestige. What it delivered was madness on the prairie. Arthur Penn's film told the story of a rustler hunted by a psychotic regulator. But Brando, in full creative revolt, improvised every line, changed costumes mid-scene, and sabotaged his own character, turning him from a bounty hunter into an unhinged parody of Law and Order. Censors and critics didn't know what to do. The film's mixture of dark humor, sadism, and social commentary was too bizarre for audiences expecting a conventional Western. In some regions of Canada and the U.S., theater owners refused to show it. France banned it temporarily for mocking violence and American values. Behind the scenes, chaos reigned. Brando arrived late, refused direction, and demanded that scenes be shot in a single take. Nicholson, exhausted, later called it the strangest film I've ever survived. The production ran over budget and over schedule, with Penn caught between two clashing titans. When it premiered, audiences walked out. But over time, critics re-examined it, realizing Brando had turned the Western into something radical, a satire about the collapse of morality itself. Beneath the absurdity was a chilling truth that civilization's madness was far greater than the outlaws. The Missouri Breaks wasn't just banned for being offensive, it was banned for being ahead of its time, a surreal mirror of an America that no longer believed in its own myths. In the 70s, the Western died, not with a gunshot, but with a whisper of rebellion. These banned films dared to ask what America didn't want to hear. What if the heroes were the villains all along? Which one shocked you the most? Subscribe, comment, and join us next time, where we uncover more films the world tried to erase.